This is the second video lecture of week 9, cities and nomads in northern Mesopotamia. And what we will be covering in this lecture is some of the extraordinary developments in the Middle Euphrates region that we talked about in the previous lecture, particularly in modern-day Syria at the sites of Amari and Ebla. In the last several weeks, if you recall, we studied the early Bronze Age, and we remained focused in southern Mesopotamia. In southern Iraq, especially the areas close to the Persian Gulf. Since that's where most of the data really came from in the early Bronze Age. But the big urban centers of southern Mesopotamia in the third millennium, that was kind of really where the hub of activity was. Now that we're shifting our focus to the north, in the aftermath of the collapse of those cities, we're looking into the second millennium, and we're seeing a fascinating sort of process of flourishing urban sites in the north, especially in this middle Euphrates landscape that we're going to talk about today. Since Euphrates really served as the major artery of communication with the Mediterranean, with the West, with Anatolia, these places like Ebla and Amari tend to become rather important. Amari was located at an important river crossing, for example. What we're going to do is we're going to look at how, in terms of sort of innovation and sponsorship of particularly architecture and visual arts, is taking place in these urban sites. In the Middle Euphrates region, large urban centers like Dura Europos that you see on the left were built right at the banks of the river on a high terrace, so that you build your city on a high terrace, so you don't actually occupy the very precious agricultural land within the floodplain of the river, the rich and green agricultural floodplain that you're seeing on the right. So beyond the archaeological site, as you can see here, Dura Europos, which is actually not very far from Amari itself, if you move away from the river, away from the archaeological site, then you find yourself in this kind of harsh steppe landscape that is really marginally inhabitable. So it is this is the home of the pastoral nomadic communities. The city the city of Amari on the Euphrates was likewise built right on the Euphrates River, in such a location, not on a high ridge like Dura Europos, but more lower close to the floodplain, and a canal was built to go through the city, bringing the water into the city, and also probably serving as a major port. And so that is which is very important for a port of trade. From the 19th century BCE onwards, an Amorite dynasty come to power in Amari. So this is a city actually that was quite powerful and very prosperous in the middle of the third millennium, contemporaneous to cities like Eshnuna and Tutub in the south that we discussed, in the Diyala Valley, or Nippur. But then they don't really survive the collapse at the end of the third millennium. And in the second millennium, we have this new Amorite dynasty who takes over the political control of the city, and they become very important sponsors of architecture, and they in fact make really interesting links to the Mediterranean network of cultural interaction and trade that is visible actually in their arts, and we're going to see that in a little bit. The city turns out to have a circular layout, a perfect circle, possibly owing to the fact that it was a new foundation of this Amorite dynasty developed in the form of a circular ideal plan or a pastoral campsite. If you look at this satellite image, we see the archaeological work on the high mound of Mari, the site of Tel Hariri, which is located on the west bank of the Euphrates. The river has moved away from Mari over time. And close to the modern, and it's located close to the modern border between Syria. It's in Syria, but close to the border with Iraq. And the Syrian town of Deir Zor is not very far. You have to go stay in Deir Zor if you want to go visit Mari. So it is identified as a really important river crossing in antiquity. Since 1933, it has been excavated by a French team of archaeologists. Mari was an important city in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, just like the southern Mesopotamian cities, and actually sharing the heritage, the sculpture and the cults and so on, sharing a lot of the religious and material culture aspects of southern Mesopotamian cities. So very well, you can say that it's very well, although it's in quite north, it's very well connected to southern Mesopotamian cities. But what we will focus today is really the 2nd millennium palace of the Amorite dynasty that you see kind of really outlined in blue, the royal palace of the second kingdom over there on the top left in this map, built by the kings of Mari in the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE over the course of several generations of kings, but ultimately and most significantly by Zimri-Lim. So what we are looking at is the plan of a really vast palatial complex, the palace of Zimri-Lim, and the other Mari kings who built various parts of it over time. We're talking about, by the time of Zimri-Lim, we're talking about a vast complex that had about 260 rooms in it. This palace was very famous in antiquity. We learn from texts that rulers would send envoys to the city so that they could observe this miraculous architecture of the palace and the very famous Court of the Palms that you're seeing a kind of a reconstruction on the right, which had wall paintings, beautiful decoration, 2 floors, and palm trees that are planted in this shady, very nice courtyard. And the very large sort of central courtyard here, 131 courtyard, was paved along the edges, and it's believed to have had these palm trees planted in the middle. So that's probably the legendary Court of the Palms as well. In the southern end of this court of the palms, jutting out into the courtyard, was a raised throne room with a semicircular podium upon which the ruler sat. You see it's throne room or shrine 132 that's marked on the plan. And then that really testified this is the place where the ruler sat, and so in court 106 on the left of that contained very extensive and complex fresco that actually also made this this palace really really famous. You're seeing an isometric view of this palace, and you can see the bottom right is the main entrance, and in that area was a little hostel where guests would stay, and some shrines, vast kitchen establishments, storage rooms. We're talking about a really an immense complex. We're talking about this fresco that I talked about from Court 106. Really testifies this kind of really cultural exchange I was talking about between Mesopotamia and the Aegean. The scene depicts the investiture of Zimrilim, the making king of Zimrilim, the adornment of the king with the status of kingship, by the goddess Ishtar, which is the Akkadian counterpart of the Babylonian counterpart of Inanna, as we knew Inanna from the south, the goddess of love and war, and who is handing him the rod and the ring in that kind of really very central scene that we're seeing there. Ishtar is actually stepping on a lion, resting her foot on a lion, and wearing a kind of a ceremonial, armed with battle gear, and she's resting her foot on a lion as kind of a representation of power. In the lower register, we symmetrically placed our water goddesses who hold pots, and water is coming out of those pots. Where actually, this is an important detail that I will come back to in a little bit with some sculpture. We actually have sculpted remains of those water goddesses, statues of them also preserved in this palace as well. So this two-register fresco composition is set within a larger landscape of palm trees and mythological creatures, including brightly colored griffins and sphinxes, mythological creatures with a lion's body and a woman's head. So this is really, in terms of its technique, and it's in terms of its this kind of landscape of exotic mythological creatures, really are speaking to the roughly contemporary Minoan paintings that we know from the islands of Crete and Thera, where similar representations of exotic landscapes and fantastical creatures are also found. And archaeologists actually have found also similar wall paintings that are contemporaneous in Egypt as well. So Egypt, Crete, Thera Island, and this Syrian region were clearly in contact, and there's some kind of exchange of ideas, technologies, visual culture that they're actually sharing in these wall paintings. This must be the hot thing to do for a king in the Mediterranean at that time, to have such a luxurious wall painting with exotic creatures. This detail from the south wall of Court 106 really tells us a great deal about the hierarchical representation, these kind of really different sizes of humans on the different sizes of actors within that scene. The scene is placed somewhere on the upper floors of the Court 106. They had fallen into the court when archaeologists discovered it, and the scene combines this kind of a register representation with really large figures, and what we see in that register representation is some kind of a sacrificial scene, procession going on. The technique of the wall painting is interesting. It's known as tempera, which is a true fresco technique, fresco secco technique, which uses sort of the painted with pigments on a layer of mud plaster, which is done when the plaster is wet, and the colored pigments are mixed with a water soluble binder, and so then this actually makes the fresco a lot sort of survive much better. If you look at the architectural composition of the throne room that opens to this court 106 with the wall paintings, we see an extraordinary setup here where the king's throne is located on a raised platform. Look at the reconstruction on the bottom left, and you can see that throne room on the top left, and on the sort of big room with thick walls on the right. So that is the throne room. On one end you have these kind of really stepped sort of niche where the king would sit there, and he would be flanked by these water goddesses that I talked about. And these water goddesses is really interestingly very extraordinary. They're preserved, and they were found intact in the palace as they were represented in the investiture scene. What is really fascinating is that they do have an embedded mechanism within these water goddesses, and you see that they're holding some kind of a water vessel, that a vase from which water would pour out, right? And so this was actually, they had a system in which they were able to run water continuously, and creating some kind of an automaton, some kind of a fountain that's actually pouring water into a basin in front of them, which would then cycle back and sort of really climb up to the body of the water goddess herself. So, which is really quite fascinating. This must have been something that really struck the visitors of the palace. In the last part of my presentation, I'd like to turn to the city of Ebla, this time in northwestern Syria, further west, and I see the site being especially an important urban center in terms of the architectural accomplishments, the architectural innovations of this time period, particularly with stone. And I'm pretty excited because of telling you about Ebla, because Ebla was one of the sites that I wrote about in my dissertation several years ago. So the site is a very large and impressive city. That was already a prosperous place in the 3rd millennium BCE. But like Mari, in the 2nd millennium, it seems to have had a kind of a rebuilding, a kind of a renovation. And it was excavated by a team of archaeologists from University of Rome. So it's an Italian project, a very nice Italian project. I actually visited this site in the late 90s. That was already excavated by then, and it was being published under the leadership of Paolo Mattier and a whole bunch of archaeologists from University of Rome. And so in the very beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, sometime between 2000 and 1900 BCE, the city of Ebla was built almost and relatively in a short time, this entire urban landscape we're talking about. And we see some extraordinary architectural innovations within this new project that was carried out by the kings of Ebla, and one of them is the the circuit wall, the fortification wall, and the four different monumental gates that you can sort of recognize in this plan a little bit. That I would like to really show you a little bit, and I will also talk a little bit about. We're going to talk about the Southwest Gate, which is marked as A with a red button in the bottom left, and then we're going to talk about Monument P3 in the very center, the black rectangular sort of building, and then we're going to talk about Temple D, which is also in that core urban area. So the Southwest Gate at Ebla is one of the really most fascinating examples of this kind of really defense design, as of the curving design that you had to enter. So it's actually two gates, an inner gate and an outer gate connected to each other with a kind of a trapezoidal sort of central court. So once you get your visitor into this court for checking, then you can control them to proceed into the city. Before they proceed into the city, they can get checked again. So it's very well controlled, flanked by two towers, and really spectacular gate structure. This inner court then was actually lined with alternating stone blocks of white limestone and black, sort of dark gray basalt. These vertical upright stones, which protect the lower halves of the walls from weather conditions, water hitting, somebody kicking the wall. So these are finely dressed, sort of upright standing blocks that protect the lower half of the wall, and it also gives some kind of an aesthetic flat finish to it. These are called orthostats, and it seems that precisely the beginning of the 20th century in Ebla and in a number of other places, orthostats seem to be a major innovation of this time period. You will see why this is important in a couple weeks when we start to talk about Assyrian orthostats and how these orthostats actually start to receive relief carving on them. We will see the importance of these orthostats, but this is the beginning point. This is the kind of really invention of this idea of orthostats in the very beginning of the second millennium BCE. And here I'm showing you the architectural plan that shows this tripartite arrangement of the gate with three protruding little towers, little bastions that provide extra substance and control for the gate. You have to go through each of these gates in order to get in to the city or get out of the city, wherever you are. And this idea of orthostats is kind of really upright standing, finely dressed blocks. We will see that this is going to be a kind of a really marker of this kind of Northwest Syrian architectural tradition. We see the orthostats also in other buildings, like Temple D. This is a temple that's actually on the high mound in the very center of the city. It must have been one of the most important temples within the city. We call it, the archaeologists call it the Temple D because we don't actually know which god or goddess, which divinity the temple was dedicated to. But as you can see, the walls are very thick, and they were built with rubble masonry, but they were lined with, on the inner side, they were lined with roughly shaped ashlar blocks, but also the important transitions. The transition from this in antis entrance to the vestibule, from the vestibule into the main cult room, are transitioned with these large orthostat blocks that were actually used at the doors. And so the main cult chamber itself was surrounded with low cut stone socle. So this kind of longitudinal, this kind of unidirectional plan going from a kind of a little porch outside into a vestibule and then into the main cult room with a cult niche at the end, this kind of really linear progression we will see is going to be a standard architectural design for Syrian temples as well. And finally, this mysterious structure that I want to tell you about, Monument P3, which turns out to be a massive cult platform somehow associated with the cult of Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar. And it is built with massive boulders on roughly hewn blocks on the outside, kind of really encasing the building with these kind of really nice, nicely dressed edges, as you can see, both inside and outside. Creating some kind of a very thick stone skin for the building. And archaeologists discovered a really wealth of cult offerings around this platform associated with Ishtar. I'd like to conclude my lecture with two sculptural pieces. The first one is a very tall stele that I'm sharing with you here that was found near that Temple D that we just discussed. It's about 170 centimeters in height, so it's quite tall. It's taller than me. It's about my height, and then it has carvings of mythological, cultic, and ritual scenes on four sides, and you can see the drawing of all of those four different sides on the right. And this is also really, we see celebration of some festival, some ritual scenes, some mythological scenes, some creatures, human-headed bull, and so on. And so we see two priestesses about to slaughter a goat, and a human being attacking a lion, and and so on. All kinds of stories being told in different portions of the stele, which is really quite fascinating. It's very hard to make it into one coherent story, but clearly they're thinking something that's kind of really complex and here. And so, but this is important as a monument because it's one of the earliest examples of such monuments, and we will see some more detailed examples of this in a little bit. And then finally, I finished my presentation with this cult basin carved out of basalt with at least 2 registers of relief representation on the side that depicts a cultic scene around an altar and a procession of sacrificial animals underneath. So the finds from Ebla are especially exciting because it really signals, it puts forward a really new visual culture that we weren't aware of until this point. This region was a lot more closer and kind of really copying almost what was going on in southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium. But when we look at the 2nd millennium, where we see a flourishing of a new identity, an entirely new local regional culture that's very powerful, very unique, very sort of self-identifying. And so this is the end of my 2nd lecture, and in the final lecture we're going to go back to the south and talk about Babylon and Isin Larsa in that area with a particular body of artifacts, terracotta plaques. So see you in a bit.